Hi there, I'm Steve Smith, CEO of Airlink, and thank you for joining me for this episode of FlightPath. Here we aim to highlight innovation, deliver insight, actionable guidance, and lessons in best practice to people working in humanitarian response and the disaster logistics space, all from experienced organizational leaders. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is a dear friend of mine and of Airlink, and someone with an unrivaled experience in disaster response, relief work, and charitable giving. She's the former director of USAID's Center for International Disaster Information, US CIDI, and has spent more than 36 years on professional staffs in the US Senate and USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. She served as a go-to resource for organizations including Facebook, the Ad Council, and the White House, and speaks at events regularly and training forums, including IOM's Forum on Diaspora Involvement in Humanitarian Action, AIDF's Global Disaster Relief Summit, and National VOAD conferences and Interactions Annual Forum. She's a deeply impressive person and has a deeply impressive CV to match, not least of which Juanita served as one of Airlink's advisory council members a number of years ago. That is essentially a non-governing advisory group to inform Airlink's strategic direction. Juanita, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to see you.
It is a joy to join you today and talk about this.
That's great. So, Juanita, you've had a really distinguished career, and there are many things we could talk about today. But you know, we're very close here on the back of the Haiti earthquake that happened a few weeks ago. We've got Hurricane Ida that's battering US states, continuing to do that. And we've also seen the recent evacuation of forces and allies from Afghanistan. But I really want to, against that backdrop, concentrate on one particular area. And that's really the work you did on raising awareness about how people give in response to disasters, and how oftentimes it can be maybe not the best thing, it can be counterproductive. And, you know, I was thinking, when I think about, you know, the thought leaders really in this endeavor, you're really right at the top of that list. And so I'm excited to be talking with you today. And, you know, on behalf of the response community, I really appreciate all of your leadership on this.
Thank you.
And so, So let's start. You know, I'm aware of this term, second disaster. Maybe you could talk to me a little bit about, you know, what's the idea behind that, and where does that come from?
Okay. The second disaster is a term that was coined by relief workers years ago to describe the impact of unsolicited material donations from the public that have been a feature of most major disasters for between 50 and 100 years. It's been a long time. So these are donations typically of used clothing, canned food, and home goods, sometimes bottled water, that no responding organization has requested or is prepared to manage and distribute in the field. So these donations come from thousands, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands of individual households. They're not expected by anyone, any responding organization in the field. They're not part of anyone's relief plan. And so no responding organization kind of owns them in the field. So they sit in ports and airports and take up valuable space that's needed by the responding organizations to stage and manage their supplies. And so this influx of unsolicited material donations has to be moved in order to make room for essential supplies. And moving them takes relief workers time, heavy equipment, gasoline, and other resources away from the response. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. They're essentially a theft from the response. And this is why the relief workers on the ground refer to them as the second disaster.
Wow. So that's really, thank you. So that's really difficult to reconcile, right? Because, you know, these are, by and large, everyone who's trying to give are good people, right? Yes. And they're really just trying to help. Yes. And you know, I'm interested how did you kind of get involved and identify? I mean, where do you start with that?
Do you mean when I'm talking to donors, or?
Just where do you start in terms of trying to combat this issue and all of the work that you've been doing and you've done in the past about how you've approached? I mean, where did you start? Where did you even begin to try and address the problem?
I see. Yes. Well, I was a novice responder in the late 1990s, and in 1998, my first big disaster was Hurricane Mitch, which affected, I think, five or six countries in Central America. Oh. And the flooding was so bad that we couldn't use the airstrip in Sotocano, the US airstrip in Sotocano. And so the only available airstrip for bringing supplies into Honduras was this tiny little strip in Tegucigalpa, which was difficult to get to, and it wasn't very big. And so I got a call one morning from one of our logisticians, and who said that we can't use the airstrip in Tegucigalpa because it's covered in used clothing. And I had never heard of such a thing. It just sounded absurd. I said, "What did you mean?" He said, "Well, it is waist deep boxes and bales of used clothing that are on the tarmac. We can't land a plane there." So this plane of needed supplies had to circle around and try to find a field that wasn't too muddy to land in. And this episode kept relief supplies from survivors for almost 2 days. So it was a 2-day delay because of clothing on the only available runway in Honduras. And mind you, this was a huge disaster. There were hundreds of thousands of people died. It affected 5 countries. It was a big disaster, and airstrips were, so necessary. And the one that was available to us, we couldn't use. And after this experience, I thought, well, certainly this was an anomaly, and this just doesn't happen. This was a craziness that was for this disaster only. But as I hung in there for another, 6 to 10 years, every major disaster had this problem of unsolicited donations taking up space needed to stage and manage relief supplies.
Wow.
Yeah. So I stopped, responding, left my work responding, and joined as the Center for International Disaster Information's director, so that I could do something about this problem at the source, which is well-intended, loving people just making decisions that were not not good in the field. Right. So that's how that started.
Well, that's great. But that had to be quite a difficult message to convey, right? I mean, how did you approach that? I mean, you must have had some resistance, and that's a challenging thing to do, because people genuinely want to help,
and they do, and they don't want to hear any negatives from people like me. So my learning curve was very high. I initially started just by telling donors the truth. So okay, back up a minute. At CIDI, I got, after every major disaster, I got dozens of phone calls, into hundreds of phone calls over the life of the disaster, from donors who had already collected stuff, and they had garages and SUVs and storage containers full of used clothing, canned food, and bottled water, and were calling me saying, "Can you help me find someone who will ship this for me?" So my approach is just be honest and say, you know what, there's no responding organization that needs used clothing. So right now we're doing search and rescue. We need search and rescue dogs and equipment, and we're going to need emergency medical equipment, and then we'll need shelter supplies. So really there's just no place for the used clothing. I'm sorry. And this approach did not work. Never once did this work, and was met with a string of obscenities, and then my being hung up on and then trolled unmercifully for days.
Wow.
So that's what doesn't work. What does work is I got together with my colleagues, and we hammered it out and figured out that discussion, someone calling me with a problem, and me telling them that their problem is giving me a problem does not work. It's like a bad day in marriage counseling. So we found an approach that does work. So I submit this for everyone who has to take phone calls like this.
Yeah.
Someone will call and they'll say, I have a garage full of used clothing. Can you send it for me? And you join with the good intention, because the people who have done this are lovely people, and the intention is loving 100%. So you join with the loving intention. You say, thank you so much for caring for the survivors of this disaster. As far as we know, no responding organization has expressed a need for what you have in your garage, but you have 3 options, okay? The first option is for you to make some phone calls and identify an organization that can use what you have collected, because they will arrange for shipping and they'll distribute it. Your second option is to repurpose your donations locally, because in every city in the United States, close by is a charitable organization that would love nothing more than to have used clothing and household goods for sale or whatever, and then you can get a tax deduction and donate the amount of the tax deduction to the charitable organization of your choice. And the third option is to recycle the goods and then take the money that you get from recycling and donate it to a relief organization that's on the ground. So that worked a little better. People still, they have, it's a big problem when your garage is full and someone is not going to save you instantly. So I completely understand the problem. And so, meeting them where they are and then giving the donor options was definitely the thing to do.
Yeah. That's interesting, and I know that one of the key phrases which I see around a lot now, and I'm sure you were on the forefront of, is that cash is king, and give cash, and that's challenging for some folks to hear, because not just because cash is cash, it's different from an old pair of boots or or a coat, but it's also it's something. There's an innate sort of desire to do something physical, right, and give something, so. But it's important to understand the fallout and the fact that a lot of these things actually cause issues when we're already. You think about all of the logistics issues you hear about. You probably don't hear about them enough, but every disaster has logistics problems. Now you add the example you just gave, and we can't even use the runway. That's really significant, isn't it?
It is. One thing I tell people is that a dollar donation, a single dollar donation to any relief or charitable organization in the field is more valuable and does more good than 100 boxes of stuff that's been collected in a neighborhood collection. And the reason is because those boxes need to be shipped, and then they need to be managed, and they need to be sorted. And all of that takes relief workers' time and gasoline and heavy equipment, all of which is very expensive. So their donation of 15 boxes of whatever may cost a relief organization hundreds of dollars to manage, whereas a dollar donation to what the organization is actually doing will do much more good, because relief organizations have sort of bulk purchasing power, so that a dollar might feed a family for a day or longer, or immunize a few children, that kind of thing. Yeah. So material donation, donors think cash, material donations, they're sort of on equal footing. They are not. Cash donations, feed the response, and material donations actually take money from the response. They are a net negative.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, you're obviously very, very passionate about this topic, and that's why we're talking here. That's great. So, as a humanitarian response sector, what can we do better? And, perhaps a second part of that question is, and what do you see some of the limitations or issues that still exist? This has been an issue for how long?
50 to 100 years. And wow. I should explain that. So there's a photograph of of clothing donations after a 1956, I believe it was, tornado in Searcy, Arkansas. So there've been clothing donations since at least the 1950s. But in academic circles where this issue is studied, there is a reference to the Halifax munitions ship fire of 1917 as a time when unneeded or unsolicited rescue personnel and supplies did not help the situation. So
Goodness.
that's why I say it's 100 years, has
Yeah.
been studied for 100 years. But
Wow.
yes.
And but thank you. But in terms of the sector itself, what can the sector be doing that's better? Because it's kind of a fragmented sector, right? The humanitarian response sector.
Yes. So I actually have a success story. So I'll tell you what you can do, and then I'll tell you that it worked. Yeah. So what we learned at CIDI is that before a disaster occurs, it's good to have, and I mean this for responding relief and charitable organizations in the humanitarian sector, to have a one-page set of instructions for donors on what is effective to donate and why, and what is not effective to donate and why, and have that up on your website, easily accessible in bright red letters all the time, not just when there's a disaster, but all the time, to educate people who want to help. And then when a disaster occurs, to make sure that that information is given to, is front and center on your website, and then also have your communications people give it to local newspapers, national newspapers, local churches in the area, because these are where, a lot of churches organize collections, churches and mosques and synagogues, and just make sure that everybody has that information as to why, what's good and what works and what doesn't work. Yeah. And the example, this actually worked. So let's see, Typhoon Haiyan, this is a super Typhoon Haiyan, hit the Philippines in 2013. And the thing about hurricanes, if you're into communications, hurricanes give you a little bit of lead time. So Typhoon Haiyan gave communications people 5 days before it hit the Philippines to talk about, what to do when this finally makes landfall. And we know it's coming, and, people were paying attention. So at CIDI, we put that information on our website. Here's how to help in a disaster. We made sure that because CIDI was working with USAID, which is part of the federal government, the departments of state and defense use the same information on their website. So if anyone went to Department of State, how do I help in the Philippines? This is, they got the same information. And then we worked with the Ad Council on a public service announcement. We got online banners with the same information. So we just made sure, we had 3 days, made sure the same information was getting to everyone who would express any interest in helping in the Philippines. And by golly, the responders in Typhoon Haiyan found 1 pallet of unsolicited donations. And this was the USAID response, 1 pallet of unsolicited stuff. And our colleagues who were in the UN reported that there was really unsolicited stuff was not a problem. And it's because we just made sure everybody was getting the same information of what works and what doesn't work. So it's possible.
Yeah, that's a great story. That's a great story. Well, I mean, it's really great to have your your thoughts and perspective on this. You're clearly an expert and a pro here. Any sort of parting thoughts you have, around what organizations can and should be doing, being on message and sharing the message is absolutely critical. And it seems like it's a disaster by disaster battle, right? To keep that going.
Yes, yes, it is. So my elevator speech, the shortest nugget of information I can give to people that is helpful, is so every disaster is unique and affects people and infrastructure uniquely. So It's easy to talk too much about it. So I try to reduce instructions to prospective donors to one thing, one thought, and that is, before you collect anything, hook up with a relief or charitable organization that wants what you're collecting. So, and the other side of that is, don't collect anything that has not been specifically requested by a relief or charitable organization that will collect it, manage it, and distribute it. Because if you don't have someone to distribute it, it's just going to sit and take up space that's needed for, emergency supplies. So that's the elevator speech. If a relief or charitable organization has not requested it, do not collect it. And instead, give $1 to a charitable organization that's going to be working in the field, not just one that's collecting donations, but one that's actually going to work in the field and helping survivors. And that will do so much more good than collecting stuff. I want to mention two more things about clothing donations. So it's not very well known that 34 countries have banned by law the importation of used clothing because it wreaks havoc on their textile industries, and even more so after a disaster. Free stuff is ruinous to a fledgling economy. So that's one thing. Another thing is, used clothing donations are not put in environmentally controlled storage. When they come, they're out on the tarmac or in the port or in the parking lot, and they sit there. And usually it's raining, or there's a hurricane, so it's wet and it's warm, and they get moldy. So mold in small amounts is an allergen, but in large amounts, in big piles of clothing, it's a toxin and can be injurious to the relief workers who have to deal with it. Big piles of used clothing also attract, snakes and rats. They're outside. Goodness. They're a great nesting ground for snakes and rats. So just consider, for those who want to donate used clothing and you don't have a recipient organization that will take care of it and distribute it, you are really asking relief workers to deal with a toxic rat and snake infested mass. And just consider that before you start putting clothing in boxes.
That's really important advice. Thanks so much, Juanita. And I really appreciate your time. I think that's probably all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
You too. It's really great to hear, and I appreciate you sharing your story. As I've said at the opener, thank you so much for your leadership in the sector. You're a real pro and very passionate about this topic. That's why we're talking today. Your support of Airlink, my organization, and in general, I think you're one of the nicest people I've met, and just a positive force in the universe. So thank you for being that way. And to my audience, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much.